The ship soared above the dense forest, the rain-soaked trees below disappearing into a green blur. Ethan sat beside the woman in the cockpit, his heart still pounding from the battle. The hum of the engines was steady, a comforting reminder that they had escaped, at least for now. The woman worked the controls with practiced ease, her violet eyes focused on the holographic displays in front of her. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at her determination. Despite everything she'd been through, she hadn't given up. He respected that more than he could put into words. "Are we safe?" he asked, glancing at the view outside. She looked at him, tilting her head slightly as if trying to understand. Then she nodded, offering a small but reassuring smile. Ethan relaxed a little, leaning back in his seat. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe. The silence between them was comfortable, but questions swirled in Ethan's mind. Who was she really? What would she do now? And what was he supposed to do next? He didn't belong in her world, but after everything they'd been through, walking away didn't feel right. She suddenly pointed to a glowing symbol on the console, then to herself. The symbol pulsed faintly, and Ethan realized it was some kind of locator. It wasn't just her ship, it was her beacon. She was calling for help. "You're signaling someone," Ethan said, piecing it together. "Your people?" She nodded, her expression hopeful. Ethan's chest tightened. Of course, she needed to go back to her world, to reclaim her place as a queen. He couldn't hold her back, but the thought of parting ways stung more than he expected. Minutes later, a new sound filled the air. Ethan looked out the window to see a massive ship descending from the clouds. It was sleek and majestic, its metallic surface gleaming in the light. The woman's face lit up with recognition, and she turned to Ethan, her expression filled with gratitude. "This is it," he said, forcing a smile. "Your ride home." The larger ship extended a docking mechanism, guiding their smaller vessel into its hold. The moment the engines powered down, the woman unstrapped herself and stood, gesturing for Ethan to follow. He hesitated but eventually rose, his legs feeling heavier with each step. The ship's door opened, revealing a group of people who looked just like her. Pale blue skin, white hair, and elegant features. They were dressed in intricate uniforms, their posture stiff with authority. When they saw her, they bowed deeply, their faces lighting up with relief. She stepped forward, speaking in her melodic language. The others listened intently, their gazes shifting to Ethan as she spoke. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the group, unsure of what to do. One of the figures approached him, their expression a mix of curiosity and respect. They said something he didn't understand, but their tone was kind. The woman joined them, her violet eyes soft as she reached for his hand. "Ethan," she said, her voice clear and steady. It was the first time she had spoken his name, and the sound of it surprised him. He smiled, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, that's me." She pressed something into his hand, a small, glowing crystal. He looked down at it, confused, then back at her. She gestured to the crystal, then to her heart, as if trying to tell him something important. "Thank you," she said, her accent thick, but the words unmistakable. Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to say so much, but all he could manage was, "You're welcome." She stepped back, her people surrounding her as they led her deeper into the ship. She glanced back at him one last time, her gaze filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Then the doors closed, leaving Ethan standing alone in the empty hold. As the massive ship ascended into the sky, Ethan looked at the crystal in his hand. It pulsed faintly, warm against his palm. He didn't know what it meant or what would come next, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had been forever changed by the queen he had found in the forest. The emergency medical bay of the human reconnaissance ship was nothing like the sterile, perfectly organized medical chambers Zora Axe was accustomed to. Patches of dried blood marked the walls. Random pieces of equipment hung from makeshift hooks. A half-eaten nutrition bar sat carelessly on a medical console, its wrapper crumpled and forgotten. Sergeant Jack Reynolds moved around the space with a casual confidence that made Zorax's scales ripple with nervous energy. She watched him, trying to understand this creature so different from her own kind. "You're staring," Jack said suddenly, not even turning to look at her. He was busy checking the shuttle's damaged communication system, his hands moving with a speed and confidence that seemed to defy the complex technology. Zorax felt a flicker of something dangerous, embarrassment. Among her people, such an emotion was considered a fatal weakness. She straightened her posture, attempting to regain her royal composure. "I am merely assessing the situation," she replied, her voice carefully controlled. Jack chuckled. It was a sound unlike anything she had heard before, raw, unpredictable, breaking through her carefully constructed emotional barriers. "Assessment complete?" he asked, turning to face her with a grin that seemed to light up the entire room. The human's face told a story. A scar ran along his jawline, another across his left eyebrow. Each mark was a testament to survival, to experiences that went beyond the clinical perfection of Veloxian training. His eyes, those remarkable human eyes, held a warmth and intensity that seemed to challenge everything Zorax understood about emotional control. "We're about 3 standard hours from the nearest Allied outpost," Jack explained, pulling up a holographic map. "The asteroid field damaged your shuttle more than we initially thought. Your navigational systems are completely fried." Zorax felt a surge of frustration. As a royal princess, she was used to having complete control. Now she was entirely dependent on this human, this unpredictable, emotional creature who seemed to operate on instinct rather than careful planning. "How did you find us?" she asked, trying to maintain her diplomatic tone. Jack's fingers danced across the holographic controls, bringing up a complex series of tracking signals. "Luck, mostly," he said with a shrug. "We were running a routine patrol when your distress signal came through. Most ships would have avoided that asteroid field, but we saw something off about the way the asteroids were moving." It was then that Zorax realized something important. The asteroid field had not been a natural occurrence. Something had been manipulating it, guiding the rocks with a calculated precision that suggested an intelligence beyond random chance. "You noticed the pattern," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack nodded. Not many would. Those asteroids were being controlled. Someone, or something, wanted to take down your ship. A moment of silence stretched between them. Two beings from completely different worlds, united by a sudden shared understanding. The implications were staggering. "We are not safe," Zorax said softly. "No," Jack agreed. "We're not." He moved closer to her, and for the first time, Zorax did not step back. Her training screamed at her to maintain distance, to preserve her emotional neutrality. But something about this human defied all her previous understanding. A warning light began to flash on the medical bay's console. Jack's entire demeanor changed in an instant, from casual to alert, his body coiling with a predatory readiness that spoke of years of combat training. "We've got company," he muttered. Outside the ship's viewport, something massive began to move. The stars themselves seemed to shift and bend around a darkness that was definitely not natural. Whatever had been hunting them in the asteroid field was not finished. And they were nowhere near help. Zorax felt something building inside her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was something else entirely. A spark of something her people had long ago forgotten. Excitement. Determination. Hope. The holographic display flickered to life, casting an eerie blue light across the ship's cramped communication center. Princess Zorax leaned forward, her scaled fingers hovering just above the projected image. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. "The Nexus Swarm," she whispered. Jack moved closer, his body tense. "You know about them." A crystalline network of interconnected entities spread across the holographic map. They weren't a traditional enemy, not ships, not living beings in any conventional sense. The Nexus Swarm was something else entirely. a collective intelligence that consumed and assimilated everything in its path. "They're why the asteroids attacked us," Zara Axe explained, her voice tight with tension. "The swarm doesn't just attack. It analyzes. It learns. Each encounter is a data point for its collective intelligence." Jack's hand moved unconsciously to a weapon at his side. "How long have they been tracking us?" The princess's scientific mind took over. "Probably since we entered the border system. They're more than just a threat. They're a computational nightmare that turns entire star systems into processing networks." The holographic display showed the swarm's progression, a terrifying web of interconnected nodes that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Blue tendrils spread across star systems, consuming everything in their path. "Your people don't know the full extent," Zara Axe continued. "The diplomatic reports barely scratch the surface. The Nexus swarm doesn't just destroy, it transforms. Entire civilizations become part of its computational network." Jack studied the map, his tactical mind working quickly. "They're not just coming for us. They're mapping potential invasion routes." A moment of silence stretched between them. Two beings from completely different worlds, united by a threat neither of their civilizations fully understood. "We need a plan," Jack said finally. Zara Axe raised an eyebrow, a very human gesture she had unconsciously picked up. "A human plan, I assume. Improvised and borderline impossible." He grinned. "The best kind of plan." Their strategy was nothing like traditional military thinking. Jack's approach was fluid, adaptive. Zara Axe's was analytical, precise. Together, they began to trace potential counter-strategies that would have been impossible for either species alone. The ship's communication system crackled to life. A garbled message came through. Part warning, part distress signal. Jack's fingers flew across the translation interface. "It's a deep space research station," he said. "They're under attack." The holographic display shifted. The Nexus swarm was already consuming the station's outer defenses, breaking through layers of technology like water through paper. "We can't save them," Zara Axe said, her voice clinical and detached. Jack looked at her. Something in his eyes changed. "We can slow them down." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. The next moments happened quickly. Jack began preparing the ship's limited weapon systems. Zara Axe, surprisingly, started helping, her scientific knowledge complementing his tactical skills. They were an impossible team, a human soldier, a Veloxian royal princess, fighting against an enemy that had consumed entire civilizations. Outside the ship's viewport, the first wave of Nexus swarm scouts began to appear, crystalline shapes that moved with an intelligence far beyond traditional warfare. Jack looked at Zara Axe. She looked back. No words were needed. The battle was about to begin. The first wave hit like a hurricane of crystal and light. Jack's combat training kicked in instantly. His body moved with a precision that seemed to defy human limitations, his hands flying across weapon controls while his eyes tracked multiple threat vectors simultaneously. The ship shuddered under the Nexus swarm's attack. Each impact was more than physical. These were computational strikes, designed to break down their systems piece by piece. "Shields at 42%, Zara Axe called out, her fingers dancing across alien technology with a speed that surprised even herself. Gone was the rigid princess. In her place was a strategist, a survivor. A massive crystal formation broke through their outer defensive layer. It wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. It was a living computation, a piece of the Nexus swarm that sought to understand, to analyze, to consume. Jack took a hit that sent him spinning across the ship's combat deck. Blood traced a wild arc through the zero-gravity environment. For a moment, everything went silent. Zara Axe felt something she had never experienced before. Fear, real, raw fear that threatened to crack her carefully constructed emotional barriers. "No," she growled, an uncharacteristically human response that would have shocked her royal tutors. The medical systems were offline. Her scientific training kicked in. She had studied human anatomy, But theory was different from practice. Jack's wound was serious. The crystal-like projectile had pierced his left side, leaving a wound that pulsed with an unnatural energy. Human medical protocols. She remembered them now. Pressure, hemostatic agent, stabilization. Her hands moved with a precision that surprised her. Each motion was a calculated risk. The ship continued to shake. The Nexus swarm was not just attacking. It was studying, learning. Jack's eyes flickered open. "That's going to leave a mark," he mumbled, a hint of his characteristic humor breaking through the pain. Zorax didn't understand the joke, but something in his spirit, this human ability to find humor in the face of certain destruction, resonated with her. "Stay still," she commanded, applying a neural stabilizer she had modified using pieces of the ship's communication system. The Nexus swarm's attack changed. No longer was it a direct assault. Now it became something more insidious. The ship's systems began to change. Computational tendrils reached out, trying to understand, to assimilate. Jack's hand found hers. The touch was unexpected. Among her people, such contact was a sign of weakness. Here, it was something else, a connection, a promise. "We're not done," he whispered. Outside, the crystal formations of the Nexus swarm began to reshape themselves. They were learning, adapting. Each moment was a new calculation, a new attempt to understand these two beings who refused to be easily conquered. Zorax looked at the tactical display. Their situation was impossible. No logical strategy suggested survival. The Nexus swarm had consumed entire civilizations. They were just two beings on a damaged ship. But something was changing inside her. The rigid Veloxian training that had defined her entire existence began to crack. Hope, defiance. These were not weaknesses. They were weapons. Jack coughed, a sound that broke through her racing thoughts. "Plan?" he asked, his voice weak but determined. Zorax looked at him. For the first time, she smiled, a real smile that would have been forbidden in her royal court. "We fight," she said simply. The Nexus swarm continued its attack. But something had changed. Two beings from different worlds, united by something stronger than logic, by something the swarm could never understand, the human spirit of survival. The medical bay was a disaster zone. Emergency systems flickered, casting strange shadows across Jack's injured body. Zorax worked with a precision that surprised even herself, her hands moving between alien medical technologies and improvised human techniques. A communication signal cut through the ship's damaged systems. The holographic display sputtered to life, revealing a transmission that made Zorax's blood run cold. "Diplomatic override," the voice announced. It was her royal handler, Ambassador Krulnax. "Princess Zorax, you are ordered to terminate your current mission and prepare for immediate extraction." Jack stirred, his eyes catching the holographic message. "They want to pull you out," he said, his voice weak but understanding. The transmission continued. "Your arranged marriage to Lord Vexthar will proceed as planned. The alliance must be preserved." Something inside Zorax shifted. The carefully constructed world of royal protocols, of predetermined paths, began to crumble. She had always followed the rules, always maintained perfect control. But now, looking at Jack, wounded, yet still fighting, she saw something different. "No," she said softly. Then louder, "No." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's not how royal protocols work, is it?" She turned to him, and for the first time, Jack saw something dangerous in her eyes. Not the calculated coolness of a Veloxian royal, but something else, something alive. "Lord Vexthar is part of the conspiracy," she explained. The words tumbled out faster than her training would have allowed. "The same group that's working with the Nexus swarm. They're not just seeking an alliance. They're planning to use my people as computational resources." The medical-based systems continued to fight against the Nexus swarm's computational invasion. Each moment was a battle between technology and survival. Jack struggled to sit up. Tell me everything." And she did. The story poured out of her. Years of hidden observations, subtle manipulations, a conspiracy that ran deeper than any single species. The Nexus swarm was more than an enemy. It was a system of total consumption, turning entire civilizations into processing networks. "My marriage," Zorak said, "is the final piece of their plan. Lord Vexthar's bloodline has been systematically modified to be more compatible with computational assimilation." Jack's tactical mind was already working. "We need evidence, something concrete to expose them." The ship's systems chose that moment to display a series of encrypted files, fragments of communication, strategic plans, the kind of information that could bring down entire governments. "The Nexus swarm," Jack said slowly. "They're collecting data. But in doing so, they've also collected evidence." Zorax understood immediately. The very technology trying to consume them had also preserved the truth. Outside the ship's viewport, the crystal formations of the Nexus swarm continued their relentless approach. But inside, something more important was happening. Two beings from different worlds were connecting the dots of a conspiracy that threatened everything. Jack reached out and took Zorax's hand. It was a human gesture of connection, of solidarity. Among her people, such a touch would be considered a profound breach of protocol. She did not pull away. "We're going to stop them," Jack said. It wasn't a question. It was a promise. The ship's systems continued to fight. The Nexus swarm continued to approach. But something had changed. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting back. The makeshift war room was nothing like the elegant strategy chambers of Zorax's homeworld. Torn military maps covered damaged ship consoles. Fragments of encrypted data danced across holographic displays. Jack moved between them, his injured body showing remarkable resilience. "We have one shot at this," he said, pointing to a complex star chart. "The diplomatic summit at Crossroads Station is our only chance to expose the conspiracy." Zorax studied the map. Her fingers traced potential invasion routes, computational pathways that the Nexus swarm might use. "It's a trap," she said flatly. "They'll expect us to try something." Jack's laugh was sharp, unexpected. "Of course it's a trap. That's why it'll work." Their plan was audacious. They would use the very systems designed to control Zorax, her royal communication channels, her predetermined diplomatic route, to transmit the evidence they'd gathered. The Nexus swarm had collected data thinking it was consuming information. Instead, it had become their unexpected ally. "Your people won't believe this easily," Jack cautioned. Veloxian culture valued emotional suppression above all else. Evidence meant nothing without the right presentation. Zorax's response surprised him. "Then we'll make them listen." The ship's remaining systems continued to fight against the Nexus swarm's computational invasion. Each moment was a battle between survival and total assimilation. But now they had a plan. Crossroads Station was a neutral diplomatic hub, a massive structure floating between multiple star systems. Hundreds of species would gather there, making it the perfect stage for their revelation. "We'll need to modify your royal transmission protocols," Jack said, pulling up complex communication schematics. "Make sure the evidence breaks through their information filters." Zorax worked alongside him. Her fingers, once reserved for delicate royal gestures, now moved with a hacker's precision. She was rewriting the very systems that had controlled her entire life. A priority communication came through. Lord Vexthar, her arranged husband and part of the conspiracy, was demanding her immediate return. The message was cold, calculated, a command disguised as diplomatic courtesy. "Not happening," she muttered. The words were pure Jack, another sign of how much she had changed. Their plan was complex. They would use the diplomatic summit's standard communication protocols to broadcast the evidence. The Nexus swarm's own computational network would become their delivery system. Every species would receive the truth simultaneously. Jack looked at her. "You know this means you can never go back to your old life." Zoroax met his gaze. Good. The transformation was complete. The rigid royal princess was gone. In her place was something new, something dangerous. Outside, the crystal formations of the Nexus swarm continued their approach. But they no longer seemed unstoppable. They seemed like what they truly were, a system that could be understood. Challenged, defeated. One last systems check, Jack said, pulling up the final transmission protocols. Zoroax's hand found his, a gesture that would have been impossible weeks ago, a connection that defied everything her training had taught her. "We're ready," she said. The ship hummed with anticipation. Crossroads Station grew larger in their viewport. Hundreds of species, countless diplomatic channels. The perfect stage for a revolution. The Nexus swarm thought it was coming to consume. They were about to learn the true meaning of resistance. Crossroads Station erupted in chaos. The moment Zoroax's transmission began, everything changed. Holographic displays across the massive diplomatic hub flickered with raw, unfiltered data. Evidence of the conspiracy spread faster than any virus, faster than thought itself. Jack stood beside her, his body still healing but his spirit unbroken. "Showtime," he whispered. Lord Vexthar's reaction was immediate. His crystalline form shifted, revealing something more sinister beneath the diplomatic facade. The Nexus swarm was no longer hiding. It was attacking. Diplomatic representatives from 100 different species watched in shock as the truth unfolded. The computational invasion that had been planned in secret was now exposed in brutal detail. Zoroax's transmission showed everything. The planned assimilation, the political manipulation, the complete destruction of individual identities. The station's defensive systems came alive. But this was different from any battle anyone had seen before. It wasn't just a physical conflict. It was a war of information, of identity, of survival. "They're trying to isolate our transmission," Zoroax called out, her fingers flying across emergency communication systems. Jack's tactical training kicked in. Redirect through secondary channels. Use their own network against them. Crystal-like formations began to emerge from the station's walls. The Nexus swarm was no longer waiting. It was attacking directly. Diplomatic representatives scrambled. Some fought. Some tried to escape. Others stood their ground. Zoroax saw her people, the Veloxians, caught between their rigid protocols and the shocking truth. Years of emotional suppression began to crack under the weight of the revelation. "We're losing secondary communication nodes," Jack warned. But something else was happening. As the Nexus swarm attacked, other species began to fight back. Not with advanced weapons, not with perfect strategies, but with something the computational collective could never understand. Adaptability, hope, individual will. A Zorkian diplomat used a maintenance drone as a weapon. A group of traitor representatives jury-rigged communication blockers. Everywhere, beings were fighting back in ways the Nexus swarm could never predict. Lord Vexthar's form began to destabilize. He was more machine than living being now, a perfect representation of the Nexus swarm's ultimate goal. "Surrender is logical," he announced, his voice a blend of mechanical precision and failed emotion. Jack laughed. It was a sound that cut through the chaos. Raw, human, completely unpredictable. "We don't do logical," he shouted. "We do impossible." Zoroax was no longer the controlled royal princess. She was a warrior, a strategist, something entirely new. The station shook. Crystal formations continued to spread. But something had changed. The Nexus swarm was no longer consuming. It was struggling. Everywhere, individual beings were fighting back. Not with perfect plans, not with calculated strategies, but with something far more powerful. The human spirit of resistance. Jack's hand found Zoroax's, a connection that defied everything the Nexus swarm understood. "Almost there," he said. The final transmission was about to begin. The last piece of their plan. The moment that would change everything. Outside the station's massive viewport, space itself seemed to hold its breath. The battle for survival had begun. Silence fell across Crossroads Station. The battle was over, but something more important had happened. The Nexus Swarm, the computational collective that had consumed entire civilizations, lay defeated, not by a superior weapon, not by a perfect strategy, but by something it could never understand. Individual will. Jack stood beside Zoroax, his body battered but unbroken. She looked different now. No longer the controlled royal princess, but something entirely new. A leader. A fighter. "We did it," he said simply. The station around them told a story of impossible survival. Delegates from hundreds of species looked at each other, truly looked at each other, perhaps for the first time. The Nexus Swarm's invasion had done something unexpected. It had united them. Lord Vexthar's crystalline form lay shattered. The final transmission had exposed everything. The planned assimilation, the political manipulations, the complete disregard for individual identity. Where once there was a perfect, controlled system, now there was only broken data. "Your people will want answers," Jack said to Zoroax. She smiled, a real smile that would have been forbidden in her royal court. "No," she replied. "They'll want a new beginning." The Veloxian diplomatic channels were in chaos. Years of emotional suppression were crumbling. The revelation had done more than expose a conspiracy. It had shown them a different way of existing. Jack's hand found hers, a simple gesture that meant everything and nothing. Outside the station's viewport, space continued its endless dance. But something had changed. The universe felt different. A communication came through. It was from the highest levels of Veloxian leadership. They were calling for Zoroax to return, to explain, to lead. "What will you do?" Jack asked. Zoroax looked at him. The princess who had begun this journey terrified of emotion now understood something profound. Feelings were not a weakness. They were a strength. "We're going to change everything," she said. The next few months were a whirlwind. Zoroax became more than a princess. She became a bridge between worlds. Her experiences with Jack had shown her a fundamental truth, that diversity was strength, that individual will could overcome any system. The Veloxian government was transformed. Emotional suppression gave way to emotional understanding. They began to learn from other species, to embrace the very things they once feared. Jack was offered multiple diplomatic positions, but he knew his role was different. He would be the connection, the bridge between what was and what could be. On the day they left Crossroads Station, something remarkable happened. Species that had been enemies began to talk, to understand. The Nexus Swarm's invasion had done what years of diplomacy could not. It had made them see each other as individuals. "Where do we go now?" Jack asked. Zoroax looked out at the stars. They were no longer just points of light. They were possibilities. "Everywhere," she said. The universe opened before them, not as a challenge to be conquered, but as a journey to be shared. The ship moved forward. Jack and Zoroax, a human soldier and a Veloxian princess, two beings who had found something more important than their individual histories, a connection that defied everything. The ion storm hit without warning. One moment, the reconnaissance ship was gliding through the quiet darkness of space. The next, violent waves of electromagnetic energy tore through its systems like a hungry beast. Alarms screamed. Lights flickered. The ship's hull groaned under the immense pressure. "Containment field at 37%, shouted Jack, his hands flying across the emergency control panel. Sparks erupted from nearby consoles, casting wild shadows across his face. Princess Zoroax watched in fascination. Her Veloxian training demanded calm in the face of danger, but something about Jack's response challenged everything she knew about crisis management. Where her people would have followed a rigid protocol, this human moved with an almost organic adaptation. "We need to reroute power," Jack muttered, pulling what looked like a standard-issue multi-tool from his belt. To Zoroax's absolute shock, he began to physically rewire a damaged circuit board. "That's impossible," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and scientific curiosity. "Your technology cannot withstand such direct electromagnetic interference. The quantum stabilizers would." Jack cut her off with a laugh. "Would what?" "Fail. Watch and learn, princess." With a series of quick movements that seemed more intuition than calculation, he connected several seemingly unrelated circuits. The ship's emergency systems stuttered, then stabilized. The alarms fell silent. Zerax stared. Among her people, such a repair would have required a team of engineers, multiple diagnostic cycles, and hours of careful planning. Jack had done it in moments, using what looked like nothing more than improvised techniques and raw understanding. "How?" she asked, unable to hide her genuine amazement. Jack wiped some grease from his cheek, leaving a dark streak across his skin. "Survival," he said simply. "In my unit, we learn to fix things with whatever we have. Space doesn't care about your training or your perfect systems. It only cares if you can adapt." The ship continued to shake. Outside the viewport, the ion storm raged, a brilliant display of destructive energy that would have terrified most species. But inside, Jack moved with a calm that seemed to defy the chaos. Zerax noticed something else now. Beneath the torn sleeve of his uniform, a series of intricate tattoos told stories she couldn't understand. Each mark seemed to represent something: a battle, a memory, a moment of survival. "Those markings," she said, pointing. "They're not standard military identification." Jack's expression softened. For the first time, she saw something beyond the soldier, a hint of the person beneath the uniform. "Each one is a promise," he explained. "A promise to someone I couldn't save before. A reminder of why we keep fighting." The concept was entirely foreign to Zerax. The Loxian culture valued collective survival over individual memory. Personal connections were seen as a weakness, something to be controlled and minimized. But looking at Jack, she saw strength in what her people would consider vulnerability. Another violent wave hit the ship. This time, Jack grabbed Zerax's hand to steady her. The touch was unexpected. Among her people, such physical contact was strictly forbidden, especially between different ranks or species. She didn't pull away. "We're not out of this yet," Jack said, returning to the damage control systems. "But we'll make it." Something was changing inside Zerax. The rigid emotional barrier she had maintained her entire life began to crack. Not shatter, not completely, but crack. Outside, the ion storm continued its savage dance. Inside the ship, two beings from entirely different worlds were learning that survival wasn't about perfection. It was about adaptation, connection.